The airspace above Northern Europe, particularly over Belgium and its adjacent corridors, has long served as a critical artery for both civilian and military aviation. This region contains a dense network of radar installations, transnational air corridors, and dual-use infrastructure essential for command, control, and logistics across the NATO alliance. Belgium's central role, hosting both NATO headquarters and a constellation of sensitive nodes tied to command and communications architecture, places its skies under continuous surveillance. On this backdrop, the sudden emergence of a series of unregistered aerial intrusions during nighttime hours triggered a systemic cascade. Multiple flight paths were disrupted, triggering emergency reroutes and locking down key sectors of national airspace. This disruption was not limited to Belgian territory. Simultaneous reports of unidentified drone formations were documented across northern France, western Germany, and parts of the North Sea corridor. Military airfields, early warning stations, and logistical hubs entered immediate lockdown procedures. All aerial movement in affected zones was reduced to military-grade transit only, with priority given to interceptor units and surveillance platforms. The pattern, density, and trajectory of the intrusions prompted an immediate strategic reassessment. Unlike prior isolated airspace violations, the event's simultaneity and proximity to nuclear storage and intelligence fusion sites signaled a coordinated probe. Defensive postures were recalibrated across NATO's northern command. Embedded within the broader European defensive grid, Belgian territory thus became the geographic and symbolic fulcrum of an unfolding airspace confrontation that forced Allied command centers into real-time response protocols. Preliminary examination of radar archives and atmospheric tracking systems revealed that the aerial intrusions had not been preceded by standard transponder signatures, electromagnetic emissions, or satellite-detectable launch events. Flight paths reconstructed from radar scatter data displayed erratic altitude shifts, sudden directional reversals, and electronic silence, typical hallmarks of low observable drone platforms. Analysts from joint NATO intelligence units initiated backward trajectory modeling, identifying multiple possible launch vectors originating near maritime cargo routes and select inland transit corridors across Central Europe. Particular attention was focused on patterns intersecting with locations of Russian-affiliated shipping consortia and transport hubs previously flagged for irregular cargo manifests. Surveillance footage from civilian and commercial sensors near Liège, Antwerp, and Ghent recorded brief visual traces of compact aerial units traveling in coordinated swarms at low altitude. Further analysis indicated a level of route optimization consistent with pre-programmed targeting sequences oriented toward high-value military and energy infrastructure. Tactical intelligence groups assembled in Brussels initiated multilateral coordination with national cyber units to detect command uplinks, signal relays, or autonomous guidance footprints. Concurrently, liaison channels were activated between Belgian, German, and French counterintelligence agencies to cross-reference drone telemetry with known patterns of foreign unmanned system deployments. The operational hypothesis shifted from sporadic reconnaissance to a multi-vector probing action calibrated to test both response times and structural weaknesses in European air defense protocols. This perspective was reinforced by the targeting proximity to nuclear storage facilities in Klein-Brogel and communications relays embedded within the Joint Warfare Center network. Given the complexity of timing and geographic dispersion, NATO command structures concluded that the drones had likely been prepositioned via civilian-appearing logistical assets, with activation time to coincide with minimal radar interference from scheduled civil flights and atmospheric anomalies. Strategic air defense units were placed on rotational alert, and modular short-range interception batteries were redeployed closer to potential second-wave approach vectors, marking the beginning of continental-scale countermeasures. The initiation of the drone wave occurred in a compressed sequence spanning less than one full rotation of regional surveillance cycles. Across multiple Belgian provinces, aerial security layers were breached at low altitudes and oblique entry angles designed to evade ground-based phased array detection. The majority of intrusions advanced below standard radar coverage thresholds, using terrain-hugging trajectories and programmed pauses behind natural and artificial obstructions. Initial penetrations were observed west of Namur, followed by synchronous incursions along the Meuse River Valley and the industrial outskirts of Antwerp. Upon crossing into proximity of critical infrastructure nodes, including forward air control terminals, dual-use logistics hubs, and NATO communications bunkers, multiple drones executed rapid vertical climbs and hovered briefly at predetermined coordinates. Electro-optical sensors and passive interception logs confirmed that several of these platforms initiated targeted interference pulses against signal arrays stationed along the Brussels-Luxembourg command corridor. One unit triggered a reactive shutdown of a secured fiber relay used for encrypted data transmission between Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe and the National Crisis Coordination Cell. Concurrently, flight formations of a separate configuration approached Klein-Brogel from the northeast. Without deploying kinetic payloads, these drones maintained stable altitude at close range to hardened aircraft shelters and auxiliary radar domes. High-resolution analysis revealed synchronized illumination of laser-ranging modules directed at specific entry points and HVAC grid lines, suggesting a data harvesting objective or calibration for follow-up kinetic vectors. At least 3 units entered proximity of the underground maintenance vaults, after which their signals abruptly terminated. Recovery teams later identified debris patterns consistent with hard termination protocols designed to self-disable upon target adjacency. No explosive residues were recovered, further substantiating a reconnaissance or signal mapping role. In the coastal zone, 2 formations crossed from the North Sea into airspace adjacent to the Zeebrugge port complex, a known transit route for military logistical resupply and classified material movement. These drones navigated tight maritime corridors, avoided commercial air traffic, and demonstrated command responsiveness consistent with semi-autonomous evasion routines. Upon reaching designated hover points, they deployed microfilament antennae and began spectrum scanning along predefined military bands. Intercept units launched from the NATO Response Force Detachment Station near Bruges engaged using modular point defense systems. One unit was successfully neutralized in flight, its internal systems rendered unreadable due to onboard chemical destructors. 2 others exited engagement zones using irregular vector shifts and submerged into radar shadow near regional power substations. Belgian Air Force elements scrambled interceptor aircraft along high-alert vectors but recorded no successful visual lock-ons due to cloud interference and signal jamming bursts emitted by the drones during ascent phases. Attempts at coordinated electronic suppression failed due to the distributed command architecture of the incursion group. Forward-deployed anti-drone teams initiated hard perimeter lockdowns around all nuclear and command facilities. Mobile jamming columns were activated to isolate the remaining operational units, while low-altitude air patrols maintained constant rotational coverage. The tactical effect of the drone wave, while not destructive in the traditional sense, achieved significant degradation of regional command coherence, forced reallocation of critical defense assets, and generated confusion across air defense hierarchies. All targeted sectors registered latency in data throughput and delayed coordination between national response nodes. Though the total material impact remained limited, the operational success of the drone entry phase exposed structural vulnerabilities in NATO's rapid response spectrum defense grid. Following the initial drone penetration and its non-kinetic operational outcomes, multiple cascading effects unfolded across the continental defense infrastructure. The immediate tactical confusion initiated by low observable intrusions led to systemic recalibrations of national air defense posture across multiple NATO members, which in turn produced temporary command isolation across at least 4 key regional sectors. This fragmentation of coordinated oversight caused significant delays in standard response sequencing. In the Belgian military's Western Command Zone, 2 scheduled aerial convoys transporting classified communications gear were rerouted mid-transit and redirected to secondary storage depots outside Mons. This deviation created logistical congestion along the military-grade rail arteries feeding into the central NATO storage grid, leading to time-sensitive backlog of encrypted hardware meant for redistribution across the joint support and enabling command in Ulm. Simultaneously, high-tension response patterns triggered automatic elevation of defense readiness states across German and Dutch border sectors. In the absence of confirmed kinetic threats, several forward-deployed battalions initiated soft lockdowns at key transit intersections, including rail control nodes near Aachen and Liège. Civilian transport corridors underwent immediate reclassification as restricted military zones, grounding over 100 commercial flights and rerouting numerous cargo convoys operating under dual clearance authorizations. This rapid activation protocol, although aligned with contingency protocols, paralyzed civilian-military interchange within the air and rail space matrix, obstructing routine logistics and forcing supply chain redirection over extended routes. Within cyber defense infrastructure, the unusual signal patterns observed during the drone operation produced anomalous overlaps with dormant electromagnetic profiles previously catalogued in relation to prior hybrid warfare scenarios. Belgian and French cyber operations units activated layered firewall protocols across key defense intranets, triggering forced segmentation of live battlefield coordination modules. These automated defense reactions cause transient desynchronization between command layers, isolating mobile artillery batteries from real-time satellite telemetry and impeding synchronization of missile defense alert protocols. The resultant blind zones in early warning grids required temporary manual oversight from stationary observation units, further increasing the personnel burden across central command outposts. In the southern corridor of the Netherlands, 2 drones were detected hovering in close proximity to the junction where multiple energy grid subsystems converge. Although no kinetic payload was released, one of the platforms emitted a concentrated burst of directed signal interference, causing the temporary failure of transformer synchronization relays in the Zuid-Holland defense power buffer. The power flux imbalance propagated downstream into the hardened relay network servicing the Rotterdam Maritime Defense Interface. Multiple naval readiness systems temporarily defaulted to fail-safe mode, delaying force projection capacity for several hours. Parallel disruptions were recorded in the coordination channels of NATO's airborne warning and control system units. Midway through patrol cycles, uplink integrity with orbital intelligence assets was lost for brief intervals, attributed to concurrent localized jamming patterns associated with the drone intrusion vector. Re-establishing satellite relays required deployment of auxiliary airborne communications relays, depleting availability of strategic airframes originally tasked with border patrol oversight. This reallocation of aerial assets narrowed aerial reconnaissance bandwidth in sectors bordering Kaliningrad and the Suwalki Gap, thus exposing Allied air corridors to temporary observational degradation. On the diplomatic front, the hybrid nature of the event catalyzed immediate friction across civil and military coordination platforms. Regional embassies initiated elevated internal threat protocols, triggering rapid reassessment of personnel movement and supply logistics within zones of elevated operational risk. Visa processing infrastructure, particularly across consular nodes tied to Russian applicants, was frozen pending confirmation of the scope of the intrusion. Internal briefings within the European External Action Service signaled the transition from incident containment to pre-sanction strategic response planning. The operational aftermath of the drone wave extended far beyond its physical trajectory, activating systemic vulnerabilities across defense, energy, transportation, and cyber sectors simultaneously. The absence of physical destruction masked the scale of disruption imposed across NATO's internal structure. Command, control, and logistics were temporarily fragmented across more than 7 operational zones, forcing reactive restructuring of regional defense oversight and providing a window of strategic disorientation that directly impacted real-time deterrence posture across Europe's central corridor. In the immediate wake of the initial disruption phase, NATO operational command centers across Central and Western Europe transitioned into direct response posture. All continental air defense grids entered synchronized escalation protocols, initiating sector-based aerial denial procedures and activating dormant intercept contingencies across priority zones. Belgian command deployed rapid response air policing units from dispersed readiness platforms, redirecting manned aircraft from standard patrol arcs into interception corridors designed to envelop potential drone escape vectors. Simultaneously, the European Integrated Air and Missile Defense Architecture initiated redundancy-based tracking routines, shifting sensor priority to short-range, low-altitude detection channels. Tactical ground units equipped with modular anti-drone systems were deployed along critical approach paths, particularly near transport arteries leading into Brussels, Liège, and Ghent. Engineer battalions reconfigured mobile radar elements into offset geometry to triangulate residual drone signal patterns, but atmospheric masking and electromagnetic noise from civilian infrastructure significantly reduced signal fidelity. Specialized signal intelligence teams from Germany and the Netherlands established joint electronic suppression corridors across overlapping airspace, deploying layered jamming protocols and attempting to cut control links. However, multiple intercepted platforms appeared to operate on preloaded autonomous instruction loops, rendering conventional electronic warfare techniques ineffective. In maritime zones, NATO naval units stationed along the North Sea launched aerial recon drones configured with spectrum mapping payloads to monitor potential offshore command uplinks. Suspicion centered on possible use of civilian-flagged maritime vessels as concealed transmission nodes. However, no direct uplink events were confirmed, and several drone traces terminated near known cargo shipping lanes without emitting recoverable control pings. The multinational naval task force initiated localized boarding protocols under existing maritime security provisions, inspecting vessels flagged for prior anomalies. These operations yielded minimal actionable intelligence but effectively disrupted logistical movement of suspect assets and increased surveillance coverage across choke points. In the airspace over northern France and western Germany, contingency interceptor wings were scrambled to expand aerial control beyond Belgian borders. Visual contact with suspected remaining drones remained elusive due to adverse cloud coverage and their erratic vector behavior. Infrared tracking yielded fragmented heat signatures inconsistent with manned aerial craft, confirming the persistence of non-traditional platform deployment. Coordinated nighttime engagement routines were rehearsed across multiple forward airbases to simulate synchronized strike packages in the event of further incursions. On the ground, civilian infrastructure near military zones underwent controlled isolation. Power substations supplying dual-use facilities were temporarily rerouted through hardened backup lines to prevent overload or unauthorized signal access. Military police units enforced airfield perimeter control under elevated readiness codes. Proximity zones surrounding communication hubs, nuclear storage complexes, and encrypted data centers were declared signal-restricted and transitioned into lockdown status. Reserve infantry elements assumed static defense roles at critical logistics junctures, ensuring continuity of force protection while advanced units remained mobile. Parallel to kinetic and electronic countermeasures, diplomatic and policy instruments were activated at the intergovernmental level. The North Atlantic Council convened an unscheduled emergency session via secure channels, during which Belgian representatives classified the drone intrusions as a premeditated act of hybrid aggression. Proposals for activation of Article 4 consultations were tabled, focusing on formal coordination of response mechanisms across all member states. Working groups were tasked with defining response thresholds for non-kinetic incursions of coordinated character. At the civilian government interface, European Union crisis units transitioned into active information control. State broadcasters were issued unified directives minimizing speculative language, and press briefings were centralized under national security ministries. Civil air traffic controllers initiated reroute protocols for all commercial flights within a 200-kilometer radius of key military installations. Commercial satellite imagery providers were instructed to defer data refresh schedules for zones under surveillance, limiting dissemination of unverified visuals. Despite partial localization of the threat, the absence of recoverable hardware with traceable manufacturing signatures complicated attribution efforts. While circumstantial indicators pointed to patterns observed in previous hybrid episodes associated with Moscow-aligned entities, definitive confirmation remained elusive. Nonetheless, strategic deterrence posture across the alliance recalibrated in anticipation of follow-on operations. The drone wave had served its tactical purpose, initiating systemic disruption, exposing procedural inertia, and challenging unity of response. The failure to conclusively intercept or trace the full extent of the swarm reinforced the perception of an adversary capable of penetrating the alliance's surveillance and reaction depth without committing conventional assets. In the aftermath of the incursion, NATO forces transitioned from active response to post-intrusion stabilization. Belgium's internal security apparatus, in conjunction with NATO's Response Coordination Cell, initiated a nationwide sweep of all known drone approach vectors, focusing on industrial perimeters, communication facilities, and energy grids that had recorded signal interference or localized anomalies. Engineer reconnaissance teams equipped with electromagnetic detection arrays conducted ground-level mapping of residual signal footprints. Their findings confirmed intermittent bursts of coded signal activity consistent with autonomous drone relays, particularly within a 5-kilometer radius of strategic defense compounds outside Brussels and Liège. These residual traces did not correspond with known civilian or commercial drone frequencies and were catalogued as probable remnants of foreign platform command sequences. No confirmed explosive events were recorded during the operation. However, fragmentary debris discovered near restricted air corridors presented evidence of hard termination protocols. Several compact frame structures recovered in agricultural sectors bore mechanical scarring indicative of in-flight self-neutralization rather than hostile engagement. Belgian military intelligence isolated segments of carbon composite hulls with embedded shielding that had resisted initial signal-based override attempts. Forensic examination identified advanced shielding against radio frequency jamming and passive thermal dispersion coatings, features not consistent with commercial drone classes. Analysis of onboard microcircuitry suggested modular architecture compatible with rapid configuration changes, supporting the theory of pre-deployment customization for target-specific missions. Security services established perimeter lockdowns at all sites where drone presence had been confirmed or where material fragments had been recovered. These zones were subjected to tiered isolation procedures, including signal suppression fields and man perimeter control. Forensic data retrieval units operating under NATO technical mandates began sequential disassembly of wreckage components. Attempts to reconstruct software command logs were met with fail-safe encryption barriers that auto-corrupted upon deep access, further suggesting foreign military-grade design. Military airfields resumed phased operations, though continued under partial alert. Satellite uplinks were re-established to their full encrypted capacity after integrity tests confirmed no residual interference. All forward operating radar and early warning systems were recalibrated with newly defined subradar filters to improve detection of low signature vectors. Civilian air traffic resumed under modified routing that bypassed sensitive zones, while logistical corridors supporting NATO communications remained under restricted movement classifications pending final threat assessment. Simultaneously, liaison teams from France, the Netherlands, and Germany coordinated the deployment of mobile counter-surveillance units to shared border zones. These teams executed multi-day sweep operations using aerial drones equipped with deep-spectrum analysis arrays, scanning for any residual telemetry. While no new drone activity was recorded, several interference echoes were detected along utility corridors adjacent to rail transfer hubs, echoes believed to be related to earlier drone trajectory masking. These zones were marked for continuous surveillance and buffer expansion. Energy infrastructure previously exposed to signal saturation was subjected to stress diagnostics. Facilities near Zeebrugge and Antwerp underwent staged pressure and load recalibration to eliminate the risk of cascading disruptions. No permanent damage was detected, but auxiliary power routing remained in place as a safeguard. National grid redundancy protocols were revised to incorporate autonomous bypasses designed to resist electromagnetic intrusion vectors of similar configuration. Data centers and military communications facilities affected during the intrusion underwent full reboot sequences under isolated mode to ensure integrity. No evidence of data exfiltration or breach was recorded, but all affected systems remained offline until full checksum verification cycles were completed. NATO's cyber coordination groups issued new encryption packages to all affected command nodes and implemented rotation of high-level access credentials as a preemptive integrity measure. Within the diplomatic domain, Belgium submitted a classified technical dossier to the North Atlantic Council outlining the technical profile of the drones involved. Based on pattern recognition, hardware signature traces, and circumstantial deployment logistics, the preliminary conclusion presented aligned the event with hybrid warfare doctrines previously attributed to Moscow's Irregular Operations Directorate. While attribution remained formally unconfirmed, the nature, precision, and strategic intent of the incursion was declared incompatible with non-state capabilities. The theater-wide stabilization process, while concluding without casualties or infrastructure collapse, left in its wake a series of hardened procedural protocols and realigned security paradigms. The defensive posture of NATO airspace, particularly in its central and northern sectors, transitioned permanently into elevated readiness status. Operational doctrine regarding non-kinetic hybrid threats was amended to incorporate mandatory rapid response deployment for any future airspace anomalies, regardless of kinetic signature or origin. This marked a structural shift in how threat matrices would be evaluated, particularly for scenarios operating beneath the traditional thresholds of warfare. The drone intrusion over Belgium and adjacent NATO territories, despite the absence of conventional kinetic engagement or visible structural damage, produced a comprehensive reconfiguration of European defense posture. The event revealed latent vulnerabilities in airspace surveillance, electromagnetic resilience, and cross-border operational coherence, particularly within sectors previously considered secure by virtue of peacetime classification or alliance proximity. The strategic calculus underpinning NATO's continental architecture was compelled to expand its threat recognition framework to include non-lethal, distributed, and multi-vector incursions that bypass traditional escalation ladders. The incursion marked a transition from speculative modeling of hybrid aerospace threats to their documented realization within a core European security zone. This shift removed ambiguity regarding the threshold for response activation and precipitated the adoption of new minimum action doctrines across multiple national chains of command. From an operational perspective, the drone wave succeeded in forcing realignment of critical defense assets, degrading regional coordination efficiency, and temporarily fragmenting the NATO command grid in Central Europe. The disorientation imposed by the intrusion sequence led to direct procedural changes in radar coverage overlap, signal relay redundancy, and high-frequency air corridor monitoring. Several NATO member states initiated accelerated procurement of autonomous counter-unmanned aerial systems, rerouted defense budget allocations toward short-range air denial technologies, and embedded electromagnetic countermeasure modules within standard logistics doctrine. Diplomatically, the event enabled Brussels to consolidate internal alliance consensus around a renewed containment framework targeting non-conventional aggression. Consultations initiated during the emergency session of the North Atlantic Council advanced to policy implementation stages, producing a tri-layered response protocol covering attribution, counter-disruption, and forward deterrence. Visa regimes tied to regions suspected of platform origination were immediately restricted. Additional waves of sanctions targeting composite materials and avionics components associated with drone manufacturing were ratified. These policy shifts were mirrored in the rapid recalibration of trade clearance frameworks for strategic port zones along the North Sea, directly impacting the mobility of flagged commercial entities within affected jurisdictions. The informational aftermath of the intrusion also altered internal narrative control procedures. The absence of visible physical damage contrasted with the high alert response levels forced governments to refine communication protocols. Civilian perception management was updated to emphasize capability narratives, procedural transparency, and resilience modeling. Defense ministries across Western Europe produced synchronized briefings designed to project coherence while selectively suppressing detailed timeline disclosures. This shift in public posture reflected a growing recognition of information space as a parallel battlefield, where perception management carries deterrent weight equal to material force projection. For Moscow, the incursion generated complex strategic blowback. Though not officially claimed or attributed, the alignment of operational signatures with prior hybrid episodes resulted in immediate diplomatic and economic isolation measures. Key bilateral talks across energy, logistics, and academic exchange domains were frozen. Strategic transport corridors crossing Eastern Europe into Western industrial hubs were subjected to expanded inspection regimes. Several military exercises scheduled to include Eastern observers were cancelled. The net effect was a measurable reduction in Moscow's political influence bandwidth within European institutional circles and further degradation of its commercial supply reliability as perceived by NATO's logistical planning directorates. At the structural level, the event entrenched a security architecture predicated not only on territorial defense but on continuity of control, signal integrity, and cross-platform coordination across domains previously marginalized in conventional warfighting doctrines. The evolution of threat posture now incorporated the possibility of non-declared pre-attack testing sequences embedded within commercial or pseudo-civilian vectors. This realization imposed lasting friction across the movement of goods, data, and personnel in high-risk corridors and elevated the role of infrastructure intelligence to priority tier within alliance-wide strategic planning. The drone night over Belgium redefined the threshold for strategic incursion. It demonstrated that in modern theaters, material destruction is no longer a prerequisite for strategic disruption. The incursion reshaped the trajectory of European defensive evolution by forcing doctrinal, procedural, and diplomatic recalibration without a single detonation. The hybrid strike produced not a battlefield, but a restructured battle space, one where electronic interference, procedural paralysis, and aerial opacity now form the frontline. Through this single event, strategic initiative transitioned from the physical domain to the domain of coordinated ambiguity, making clear that future engagements may begin without fire but conclude with a full-spectrum realignment of continental security architecture.